The words hit me like a physical blow across our parents' mahogany dining table, each syllable designed to cut deep and leave scars that would last a lifetime. "You're a failure. You'll never be anyone." Michael's voice carried the weight of 32 years of accumulated disappointment, his successful lawyer's training evident in how precisely he'd chosen each word to inflict maximum damage. I sat frozen in my chair, the fork halfway to my mouth, trembling in my grip as the rest of our family dinner continued around us, as if nothing had happened. Mom busied herself cutting her pot roast into unnecessarily small pieces, while Dad suddenly found his wine glass fascinating enough to study like a laboratory specimen. My sister Lisa cleared her throat and changed the subject to her youngest daughter's piano recital, desperate to restore the veneer of family harmony that Michael had just shattered. It was Christmas Eve 2011, and I'd made the mistake of mentioning my latest job interview, a position at a small marketing firm that I'd been excited about despite the modest salary. In the context of our family gathering, where Michael's law firm partnership and Lisa's husband's medical practice dominated conversation, my enthusiasm must have seemed pathetic. "Anna's just going through a phase," Mom said weakly, her voice carrying the forced optimism she'd been using to explain my struggles for the past decade. "Everyone finds their path eventually." But Michael wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just delivered a closing argument to a jury he knew he'd already won. "Some people find their path, Mother. Others just keep making the same mistakes over and over, expecting different results. Anna's 28 years old. When exactly is this magical transformation supposed to happen?" I swallowed hard, tasting the bitter cocktail of humiliation and rage that had become familiar during these family gatherings. My throat felt like it was closing as I fought back tears that would only prove Michael's point about my emotional instability and lack of professional composure. The really devastating part wasn't the cruelty of his words. I'd learned to expect that from my older brother, the golden child who'd never failed at anything in his charmed life. What hurt was the silence that followed, the way everyone at the table accepted his assessment as reasonable, rather than abusive. "I should go," I whispered, setting down my fork and pushing back from the table. "I have an early morning tomorrow." It was a lie. I had nowhere to be on Christmas Day except back in my studio apartment, alone with my failures, and the growing certainty that Michael might be right about my prospects for ever becoming someone who mattered. As I gathered my coat and purse, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and saw what my family saw. A woman in discount store clothes who couldn't hold down a job, maintain a relationship, or apparently contribute anything meaningful to family conversations. My brown hair needed professional styling I couldn't afford. My outfit was assembled from thrift store finds, and my eyes held the defeated expression of someone who'd heard, "You're a failure," so many times. It had become an internalized truth. 10 years later, I would remember this moment with perfect clarity, not because of the pain Michael had caused, but because of the phone call that would change everything between us. The call from Columbia University's financial aid director, confirming full payment of his son David's tuition. The receipt bearing my signature that would expose secrets I'd kept hidden for a decade. But that Christmas Eve in 2011, driving home through empty streets while my family continued their celebration without me, I was just a 28-year-old failure who'd been publicly humiliated by the brother who was supposed to love her. I couldn't have imagined then that failure would teach me lessons about success that Michael, for all his achievements, would never understand. Or that the woman he'd dismissed as worthless would become the invisible force holding his own family together when their perfect world began to crumble. Growing up in the Davidson household was like living in a meritocracy, where love was distributed based on achievement rather than need. Michael, 18 months older than me, had claimed the position of family prodigy before I could even walk, setting a standard of excellence that would define my entire childhood as a series of inadequate attempts to measure up. Our parents, both professors at the local university, believed in academic rigor and intellectual competition as character-building tools. What they didn't realize was that constantly comparing their children created a zero-sum dynamic where Michael's successes automatically highlighted my failures, and my struggles reflected poorly on his accomplishments. Michael excelled at everything effortlessly. Mathematics came naturally. Languages were intuitive. Sports required minimal practice for maximum results. By age 10, he was already being discussed as gifted, placed in accelerated programs that separated him from ordinary students like me, who struggled with basic concepts that seemed obvious to everyone else. "Michael has such a brilliant mind," Mom would tell her colleagues when they visited for dinner parties. "We're already looking at early admission programs for high school. He could easily graduate at 16 if he wanted to." Meanwhile, I sat at the children's table during these gatherings, invisible to adults who were too fascinated by my brother's precocity to notice that his younger sister existed. When they did acknowledge me, It was usually with polite questions about whether I shared Michael's intellectual gifts, followed by uncomfortable silences when it became clear that I didn't. School became a daily reminder of my inadequacy. Teachers who'd had Michael expected his sister to demonstrate similar aptitude, expressing disappointment when I struggled with assignments he would have completed in half the time. Parent-teacher conferences were exercises in damage control, with explanations about how not all children develop at the same pace, and assurances that I was doing my best. The worst part was that Michael wasn't intentionally cruel during our childhood. His superiority was so natural that he didn't need to work at maintaining it. He genuinely couldn't understand why I found difficult the things that were easy for him, and his attempts to help often made me feel more inadequate rather than supported. "It's simple, Anna," he would say when I asked for help with algebra homework. "You just need to think logically instead of getting emotional about numbers." The implication that my struggles were caused by emotional rather than intellectual limitations became a theme that would follow me into adulthood. High school intensified the contrasts between us. Michael was valedictorian, National Merit Scholar, and accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship. I graduated with a B- average and a community college acceptance letter that felt like public acknowledgement of my mediocrity. Our parents' pride in Michael was matched by their bewilderment about me. They weren't cruel or neglectful, just genuinely confused about how two children raised in the same household with the same opportunities could turn out so differently. "Maybe Anna should consider a practical degree," Dad suggested during my senior year. "Something in business or social services where intellectual demands aren't as rigorous. Not everyone needs to be an academic high achiever." The comment was meant to be supportive, but it felt like official confirmation that my family had given up expecting anything impressive from me. I was being relegated to the category of children who needed backup plans and safety nets, rather than prestigious universities and brilliant careers. Lisa, our younger sister, wisely positioned herself as the family diplomat, excelling enough to earn parental approval while avoiding direct competition with Michael's impossible standards. She became the bridge between his achievements and my struggles, translating his casual arrogance into gentler language and deflecting our parents' disappointed questions about my future. By the time I left for community college, our family dynamic was firmly established. Michael was the son who would carry on the family's intellectual legacy. Lisa was the daughter who would marry well and raise accomplished children, and I was the family member who needed managing, rather than celebrating. The pattern that began in childhood, Michael's effortless success highlighting my obvious limitations, continued into our adult lives. He graduated from Harvard Law School, joined a prestigious firm, married a beautiful doctor, and produced perfect children who inherited his intellectual gifts. I bounced between jobs, accumulated student debt, and provided material for family conversations about helping Anna get on her feet. But what none of them understood was that being dismissed as a failure had taught me something valuable about resilience, creativity, and the motivation that comes from having nothing left to lose. While Michael coasted on natural talent and family expectations, I was learning to survive through determination and innovation. The skills I developed, struggling to keep up, would eventually serve me better than his effortless achievements served him. But that lesson was still years away from the Christmas dinner where he would publicly declare me a failure, unaware that failure was teaching me to become someone he could never imagine. The apartment I moved into after that devastating Christmas dinner was a studio in the worst part of downtown, with thin walls that transmitted every argument from neighboring units and heating that worked sporadically during the harsh winter months. The rent was $400 a month, still more than I could comfortably afford on my income from 3 part-time jobs that barely covered basic survival. I worked mornings at a coffee shop where entitled college students complained about foam art and demanded discounts they didn't deserve. Afternoons were spent data entry at a medical billing company, mindlessly inputting insurance codes while supervisors monitored our keystrokes per minute and bathroom break duration. Evenings belonged to freelance graphic design work that paid little but kept my creative skills sharp and my hopes alive. The graphic design gigs came through online platforms where I competed with thousands of other desperate creatives, bidding on projects that paid $50 for work that should have commanded $500. I designed logos for failed startups, brochures for pyramid schemes, and websites for small businesses that usually folded before paying their final invoices. "You're undervaluing your work," my friend Carla told me during one of our rare coffee dates. She worked in marketing for a major corporation and couldn't understand why I accepted such low-paying projects. "Demand what you're worth instead of settling for scraps." But I wasn't sure what I was worth, and I couldn't afford the luxury of turning down paying work while I figured it out. Every dollar mattered when you were living paycheck to paycheck, when unexpected expenses like car repairs or medical bills could trigger weeks of choosing between food and rent. The isolation was almost worse than the financial stress. My old college friends had moved on to careers and relationships that filled their social media feeds with engagement announcements, promotion celebrations, and vacation photos that highlighted how far behind I'd fallen. I stopped checking Facebook after seeing too many posts about achievements I couldn't relate to and happiness I couldn't access. Dating was impossible under these circumstances. How do you explain to potential partners that you're 29 years old and working 3 jobs to afford a studio apartment with a broken refrigerator? The few men I met through dating apps lost interest quickly, once they realized I wasn't going anywhere impressive or accumulating anything valuable. Michael's words echoed in my head during the worst moments, when I was rejected for jobs I was qualified for, when clients refused to pay for completed work, when my car broke down and I had to choose between repairs and groceries. You're a failure. You'll never be anyone. The prophecy seemed to be fulfilling itself with every setback and disappointment. But gradually, something began to shift. The graphic design work, despite its low pay, was teaching me about digital marketing, user experience, and the technical skills that were becoming essential in an increasingly connected world. I started noticing patterns in what made some businesses succeed online while others failed spectacularly. I began experimenting with my own small projects, designing simple websites for local businesses, creating social media strategies for friends' small enterprises, learning programming languages through free online courses during my rare free hours. The work was still poorly paid, but I was accumulating knowledge and skills that felt more valuable than the college degrees that had failed to translate into meaningful opportunities. The breakthrough came when I designed a simple app for tracking personal expenses, something I'd created for my own use to manage my complicated financial juggling act. I submitted it to an App Store contest on a whim, never expecting anything beyond the satisfaction of having completed a project. When the notification arrived that my app had won second place and a $5,000 prize, I stared at my phone screen for 10 minutes, certain there had been some mistake. $5,000 was more money than I'd ever had at one time, enough to pay off some debt and maybe take a risk on a larger project. The prize money funded my next experiment, a more sophisticated budgeting app targeted at people struggling with financial management. This time, I invested in professional marketing and user testing, approaching the project with the business discipline I'd learned from watching other people's mistakes. The app gained modest traction, generating enough revenue to quit one of my part-time jobs and dedicate more time to development. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was proof that the skills I'd been accumulating through years of struggle might actually be building toward something significant. Michael remained unaware of these small victories. Family contact had dwindled to obligatory holiday calls, where he briefly inquired about my employment situation before launching into updates about his law practice and his family's achievements. I didn't mention the apps or the slowly growing income, partly from pride, partly from superstition, that talking about early success might jinx its development. The struggling years were teaching me lessons that Michael's privileged path had never required him to learn: how to persist through repeated failures, how to find opportunity in unlikely places, and how to build something from nothing when no one believes in your potential. But the most important lesson was still coming: that success achieved through struggle creates a different kind of strength than success that comes easily, and that the brother who dismissed me as worthless was about to need the very skills his words had forced me to develop. By 2016, my financial situation had stabilized enough that I could afford a 1-bedroom apartment with working heat and a refrigerator that didn't sound like a dying animal. My apps had evolved into a small but profitable business, generating consistent revenue from users who appreciated software designed by someone who understood financial struggle intimately. It was during this period of modest success that I learned about David's diagnosis. Michael's 7-year-old son had been experiencing developmental delays, and extensive testing had revealed a rare neurological condition that would require years of specialized therapy and educational support. I discovered this not through family communication. Our relationship remained distant and formal, but through Lisa, who called me in tears one evening to share the devastating news. "Michael's trying to be strong for Sarah, but he's falling apart," she told me. "The treatments aren't covered by insurance, and even with his salary, the costs are overwhelming. They're talking about taking out a second mortgage on the house." My first instinct was complicated satisfaction. The golden child who dismissed me as a failure was facing a crisis that his perfect life hadn't prepared him for. But that vindictive feeling was quickly overwhelmed by concern for David, an innocent child who didn't deserve to suffer because of his father's pride or his family's financial limitations. That night, I researched David's condition extensively, learning about treatment options, specialist recommendations, and the brutal costs associated with providing optimal care. The numbers were staggering: hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of his childhood for therapies that could mean the difference between independence and lifelong assistance. I also researched Michael's financial situation. using skills I'd developed for competitive business analysis to understand his true circumstances. Despite his successful law practice and doctor wife, they were carrying substantial debt from medical school loans, their mortgage on a house in an expensive neighborhood, and the kind of lifestyle inflation that comes with dual professional incomes. The idea came to me gradually, born from the realization that I could help without sacrificing my own carefully rebuilt security. My business was generating enough profit that I could establish a charitable foundation, technically legal and completely anonymous, that would provide financial assistance to families dealing with pediatric neurological conditions. Setting up the foundation required careful legal work and financial planning. I hired attorneys and accountants who specialized in charitable organizations, creating structures that would allow for anonymous donations while maintaining proper documentation for tax purposes. The first grant from the Hope Springs Foundation paid for David's initial evaluation at a specialized clinic in Boston. I watched from a distance as Michael and Sarah gratefully accepted what they believed was assistance from a national organization that had somehow identified their son's case as worthy of support. Over the following months, the foundation covered occupational therapy sessions, specialized tutoring, adaptive equipment, and travel expenses for treatments that weren't available locally. Each check was processed through layers of administrative complexity that made tracing the source nearly impossible. I had to be careful not to make the assistance too generous or too perfectly timed. It needed to appear like institutional charity rather than personal intervention. This meant watching Michael struggle with some expenses while fully covering others, a delicate balance between helping and maintaining anonymity. The emotional cost was significant. I was sacrificing my own desires, the travel I'd never afforded, the home I couldn't yet buy, the security I was still building, to help a brother who'd publicly humiliated me and shown no remorse for his cruelty. But seeing David's progress made the sacrifice worthwhile. Lisa provided updates about his improvements, his growing confidence, his increased social skills. The little boy I'd barely known because of our family's estrangement was thriving because of treatments his parents couldn't have afforded without anonymous assistance. My business continued growing during this period, partly because the experience of managing the foundation had taught me about nonprofit marketing, administrative efficiency, and large-scale financial management. The skills I was developing through secretly helping my nephew were making me a more sophisticated entrepreneur. By 2018, I was running multiple apps with six-figure annual revenue, managing a small team of contractors, and operating a foundation that had helped dozens of families beyond just David's. The struggling waitress Michael had dismissed as worthless had become successful enough to transform lives while remaining completely invisible to the people she was helping. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using wealth Michael didn't know I possessed to solve problems he couldn't handle, despite his prestigious career and advanced degrees. The failure he'd predicted was secretly keeping his family from financial ruin, while he remained unaware that his salvation was coming from the sister he'd written off. But maintaining the secrecy was becoming increasingly difficult as David's needs expanded, and my assistance necessarily became more substantial. The foundation had covered occupational therapy and tutoring, but his approaching high school years would require specialized educational programs that cost tens of thousands of dollars annually. The decision to pay for David's college tuition in advance was risky. Such a large, early payment would require more paperwork and increase the chances of discovery, but it would also ensure that his educational future was secure regardless of his parents' financial circumstances. When I authorized the payment to Columbia University for 4 years of undergraduate tuition and fees, $250,000, I knew I was crossing a line that made discovery almost inevitable. But David deserved the security of knowing his future was protected, even if it meant the end of my carefully maintained anonymity. While I was secretly funding his son's care, Michael was drowning in a crisis that challenged everything he'd believed about his own competence and control. The confident lawyer who'd built his identity around effortless success was facing problems that couldn't be solved through legal expertise or intellectual superiority. David's diagnosis had hit him like a physical blow, shattering the assumption that his perfect genes and privileged circumstances would guarantee perfect children. Watching his son struggle with tasks that came naturally to other children triggered a helplessness that Michael had never experienced in his charmed life. "I don't understand why this is happening," he confided to Sarah during one of their late-night conversations about treatment options. "We did everything right. Good nutrition during pregnancy, early childhood education, the best pediatric care. How could we have missed something so fundamental?" Sarah, exhausted from juggling her medical practice with David's intensive care needs, tried to provide reassurance while managing her own guilt and confusion. "It's not about anything we did wrong. Sometimes genetics just creates challenges that no amount of planning can prevent." But Michael's worldview had been built on the belief that proper planning, superior intelligence, and hard work could control outcomes. His entire career was based on solving complex problems through research, strategy, and meticulous preparation. David's condition represented a problem that couldn't be fixed through conventional methods. The financial pressure was relentless and escalating. Each specialist consultation cost hundreds of dollars before insurance adjustments. Occupational therapy sessions were $150 per hour, recommended 3 times weekly. The educational consultant who evaluated David's needs charged $200 per hour for assessments that revealed the need for even more expensive interventions. Michael had always been comfortable with money. His law firm partnership provided a substantial salary, Sarah's medical practice contributed additional income, and their investment portfolio had grown steadily through careful planning. But David's condition was consuming resources faster than they could generate them. "We need to consider remortgaging the house," Sarah suggested during one of their increasingly frequent financial planning sessions. "The equity could fund several years of treatment while we figure out long-term solutions." The suggestion felt like failure to Michael, admission that his professional success wasn't sufficient to protect his family from hardship. Lawyers weren't supposed to struggle with money. They were supposed to be the people other families hired when they needed financial or legal problems solved. Pride prevented him from seeking help from family members, particularly after he'd been so dismissive of Anna's struggles during their last significant interaction. How could he ask for assistance from parents he'd disappointed or siblings he'd criticized when he'd built his identity around being the family member who had everything under control? The stress began affecting his work performance. Clients noticed his distraction during meetings. His preparation seemed less thorough than usual, and his usually sharp legal arguments lacked their customary precision. Partners at the firm were starting to question whether Michael was handling his caseload effectively. "You need to take some time off," his senior partner suggested after Michael missed several important deadlines. "Deal with your family situation before it impacts your career permanently. The firm will support you, but we can't carry underperforming partners indefinitely." The threat was subtle but clear. Michael's position was secure only as long as his personal problems didn't interfere with his professional responsibilities. Taking time off meant reducing his income precisely when his family needed maximum financial resources. Sarah was facing similar pressures in her medical practice. David's appointments often conflicted with her patient's schedule, forcing her to reschedule procedures and disappoint patients who depended on her availability. The emotional strain of watching her son struggle was compounded by guilt about neglecting her professional obligations. Their marriage, previously stable and comfortable, began showing signs of strain. Financial stress combined with exhaustion from David's intensive care needs left little energy for maintaining their relationship. Conversations became tactical discussions about schedules and expenses rather than emotional connections between partners. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing," Sarah confessed one evening after a particularly difficult therapy session with David. "Maybe we're pushing too hard, expecting too much improvement too quickly." "We have to believe the treatment will work," Michael replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "The alternative is accepting that David will never reach his full potential, and I can't do that." The mysterious appearance of the Hope Springs Foundation felt like divine intervention. The organization's letter explaining their mission and David's selection for assistance seemed too perfectly timed to be coincidental, but Michael was too grateful to question the logistics carefully. "Someone nominated David for this program," he told Sarah, reading the foundation's explanation for their interest in his son's case. "They must have heard about his condition through our medical network and recognized his potential for improvement with proper support." Sarah, more skeptical by nature, wondered about the foundation's funding sources and selection criteria. "It seems unusual for a national organization to focus on individual cases like David's. Most charitable foundations work through institutions rather than direct family assistance. But the foundation's checks cleared reliably, their administrative staff was professional and knowledgeable, and David's progress under their sponsored care was undeniable." Michael chose to accept the miracle rather than investigate its origins, grateful for assistance that was allowing his son to thrive while preserving his family's financial stability. He never suspected that his salvation was coming from the sister he'd dismissed as worthless, or that the failure he'd predicted was secretly preventing his own family's financial collapse through success he couldn't have imagined. Managing David's care through the Hope Springs Foundation required a level of operational sophistication that pushed my business skills in directions I'd never anticipated. What had started as a simple desire to help my nephew had evolved into a complex charitable enterprise, serving dozens of families while maintaining complete anonymity about its true benefactor. I hired Maria Santos, a former nonprofit administrator who specialized in family assistance programs, to serve as the foundation's executive director. She managed day-to-day operations while believing that our funding came from a network of anonymous tech entrepreneurs who preferred to remain unnamed for privacy reasons. "The benefactors are very particular about maintaining their anonymity," I explained during her interview, speaking as the foundation's administrative coordinator rather than its actual founder. They've been successful in Silicon Valley and want to give back without the publicity that usually accompanies large charitable donations. Maria's expertise was invaluable for creating systems that could provide assistance while maintaining appropriate documentation and oversight. She developed application processes, established evaluation criteria, and created communication protocols that made the foundation appear institutional rather than personal. The technology I'd developed for my apps proved essential for managing the foundation's complex logistics. I created secure databases for tracking recipients, automated systems for processing payments, and encrypted communication tools that allowed me to monitor David's progress without revealing my identity. David's case files, accessible through the foundation's secure portal, became my window into his development and his family's continuing struggles. I read therapy reports, educational assessments, and medical updates with the intensity of a parent monitoring her own child's progress. David shows remarkable improvement in fine motor skills following consistent occupational therapy, read one report from his therapeutic team. His social interaction has increased significantly, and he's beginning to demonstrate academic abilities that were previously masked by processing difficulties. Each positive update validated the sacrifice I was making, the money I was spending, and the emotional energy I was investing in a nephew I barely knew because of our family's estrangement. But each report also revealed new needs: specialized computer software, adaptive equipment, additional therapy sessions that stretched beyond the foundation's current assistance levels. I had to be strategic about expanding David's support to avoid raising suspicions about the foundation's unusually comprehensive interest in one particular case. I created additional recipients with similar needs, spreading resources across multiple families to make David's assistance appear less exceptional. The Anderson family in Oregon received funding for their daughter's autism therapy. The Chens in California got support for their son's physical rehabilitation following a brain injury. The Johnsons in Texas received assistance with their daughter's educational needs related to cerebral palsy. Each family was real, carefully researched, and genuinely deserving, but they also served as cover for the foundation's primary mission of supporting my nephew's development. I was building a legitimate charitable organization around the specific goal of helping David while maintaining plausible deniability about my personal involvement. The financial complexity was staggering. My business needed to generate enough profit to fund both my own security and the foundation's expanding operations. I was essentially running two full-time enterprises, my app development company and a charitable foundation, while maintaining the fiction that I was merely an administrative employee of both organizations. My apps evolved to serve a broader market, generating revenue that could support the foundation's growth. I developed budget management tools for nonprofits, project management software for small businesses, and communication platforms for distributed teams. Each success increased my ability to fund David's care while building legitimate business credentials. By 2019, I was managing a 7-figure enterprise that operated internationally while remaining completely invisible to my family. The struggling failure Michael had dismissed was running organizations that employed dozens of people and served hundreds of clients, all while secretly ensuring his son's optimal development. The emotional cost of maintaining such elaborate secrecy was becoming unsustainable. I was living a double life that prevented genuine relationships and required constant vigilance about maintaining my various identities. Friends who knew me as Anna, the app developer, couldn't learn about my charitable work. Foundation associates who knew me as an administrative coordinator couldn't discover my business success. David's approaching high school graduation forced a decision about college funding that would require unprecedented financial commitment and documentation. Columbia University's financial aid office would need detailed paperwork about the foundation's decision to prepay 4 years of undergraduate education for a student they'd never heard of. I worked with Maria to develop a comprehensive scholarship program that would make David's full-ride assistance appear routine rather than exceptional. The Hope Springs Future Leaders Scholarship would identify promising students with neurological challenges and provide complete educational funding through graduate school. "This is incredibly generous," Maria said as we finalized the scholarship criteria. "Full undergraduate and graduate funding is almost unprecedented in private foundation work. The benefactors must be extraordinarily committed to educational access. They believe that transforming individual lives creates ripple effects that benefit entire communities," I replied, repeating the philanthropic philosophy I'd developed to explain my anonymous donors' motivations. "Education is the most effective intervention for breaking cycles of limitation, and creating generational change. David became the scholarship program's first recipient, selected through a competitive process that included dozens of other qualified candidates. His acceptance to Columbia University with full financial support appeared to be the result of academic merit, combined with institutional assistance, rather than family intervention. The authorization letter I signed for David's tuition payment was the moment I crossed the line between anonymous assistance and inevitable discovery. My signature on a $250,000 transaction would create a paper trail that connected me directly to his educational funding, ending years of carefully maintained secrecy. But David deserved the security of knowing his future was protected, and I was finally ready to face the consequences of revelation. The failure Michael had predicted was about to be exposed as the success that had been keeping his family afloat. While my family remained unaware of my growing success, my technology companies had expanded into a constellation of interconnected businesses that served markets across 3 continents. What had started as simple budgeting apps had evolved into sophisticated financial management platforms used by millions of individuals and thousands of organizations. The breakthrough came when I realized that my personal experience with financial struggle had given me insights into user needs that traditionally educated entrepreneurs missed entirely. While MBA graduates designed apps for people like themselves, affluent professionals managing investment portfolios, I was creating tools for people who needed to squeeze maximum value from minimum resources. My flagship product, Budget Bridge, became the leading personal finance app for users earning less than $50,000 annually. It included features that expensive financial planning software ignored, tracking irregular income from multiple part-time jobs, managing bill payments with unpredictable cash flow, and finding legitimate side income opportunities that didn't require upfront investment. "You've identified an underserved market that nobody else was addressing," explained Jennifer Kim, the venture capital partner who led my first major funding round. "Most fintech companies focus on wealth management for people who already have money. You're serving people who need money management to survive and thrive." And the $2 million investment allowed me to hire a development team, expand into adjacent markets, and accelerate product development cycles that had previously been limited by my individual capacity. But I maintained controlling interest in all my companies, ensuring that growth wouldn't compromise my ability to fund the foundation or maintain my anonymity. Budget Bridge's success attracted acquisition offers from major financial services companies who wanted access to our user base and our technology for reaching low-income markets. I declined offers that would have made me instantly wealthy but cost me operational control, instead choosing to grow organically while maintaining independence. My second company, Small Biz Boost, developed project management and communication tools specifically designed for businesses with fewer than 20 employees. Traditional enterprise software was too expensive and complex for small operations, creating a gap that my platforms filled with affordable, intuitive solutions. "Anna understands small business challenges because she's lived them," said Carlos Martinez, who ran a family restaurant that used our entire software suite. "Her tools solve real problems instead of creating new ones, and they're priced for businesses that count every dollar." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was becoming exactly the kind of entrepreneur Michael's legal firm represented: successful technology executives who needed sophisticated legal advice for complex business transactions. But my success remained invisible to him because it existed in markets and communities he didn't interact with professionally or socially. My third venture, Nonprofit Navigator, provided administrative and fundraising tools for charitable organizations. This business served dual purposes, generating revenue to support my own foundation while learning about nonprofit operations that improved my ability to manage David's assistants effectively. "The platform saves us probably 20 hours per week on administrative tasks," explained Robert Foster, executive director of a youth education nonprofit. "We can focus on serving kids instead of fighting with spreadsheets and paperwork." By 2020, my companies employed 47 people across 6 countries, generated 8-figure annual revenue, and served over 3 million users worldwide. I'd built my empire around the principle of solving problems for people who couldn't afford expensive solutions, creating sustainable businesses while addressing genuine social needs. The COVID-19 pandemic actually accelerated my company's growth, as small businesses and nonprofits desperately needed affordable technology solutions for remote work and virtual fundraising. My platforms were designed for organizations with limited resources, making them ideal for institutions struggling with pandemic-related financial pressures. Media attention began focusing on my companies as examples of successful social entrepreneurship, though I carefully maintained personal privacy while allowing my businesses to receive recognition. Tech publications wrote about the mysterious founder who'd built multiple successful companies while refusing most interview requests and maintaining unusual anonymity for someone of my professional stature. Anna Davidson represents a new model of tech entrepreneurship, wrote Sarah Chen in Tech Weekly. Her companies prioritize social impact over maximum profit extraction, serving markets that venture capital typically ignores while building sustainable, profitable businesses. The financial success gave me resources to expand the Hope Springs Foundation's operations far beyond David's individual needs. We were serving over 200 families annually, funding medical treatments, educational programs, and family support services that transformed lives while maintaining complete anonymity about our primary benefactor. David's progress continued to exceed expectations. His high school graduation was a celebration of achievements that might not have been possible without the intensive support my foundation had provided. Lisa sent me photos from the ceremony, my nephew in his cap and gown, Michael and Sarah beaming with pride, the whole family celebrating a milestone that represented years of struggle and intervention. David's planning to study computer science at Columbia, Lisa told me during one of our irregular phone calls. He's so excited about the scholarship he received. Michael keeps saying it's a miracle that the foundation selected David for such comprehensive support. I smiled, knowing that the miracle was actually the result of careful planning, substantial financial investment, and love that Michael couldn't recognize because it came from someone he'd written off as worthless. The failure he'd predicted was secretly funding his son's transformation into a confident young man with unlimited potential. My business empire continued expanding into new markets and technologies. I'd started investing in other entrepreneurs who were solving problems for underserved communities, building a portfolio of companies that shared my values while generating returns that supported even greater charitable giving. The wealth I was accumulating felt surreal after years of financial struggle. My personal net worth had reached levels that would have seemed impossible during those desperate years of working 3 jobs to afford a studio apartment. But the money felt meaningful only when it was being used to create opportunities for other people who were facing the kind of challenges I'd overcome. I bought a house in the hills outside the city, not a mansion, but a comfortable home with space for the family I hope to build someday, and an office where I could manage my growing enterprises without the isolation of working from coffee shops and cramped apartments. The house also had a dedicated conference room where I could hold video calls with my distributed team without revealing my personal living space. Privacy had become essential as my public profile grew, and my companies attracted increasing attention from competitors and media outlets. But the success felt incomplete without family to share it with. I was building an empire while remaining estranged from the people who should have been celebrating my achievements. Michael's dismissal had created a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge, even as I was secretly supporting his family through the most challenging period of their lives. The decision to reveal myself through David's college tuition payment was motivated partly by exhaustion from maintaining elaborate secrecy, but mostly by the recognition that my nephew deserved to know who had invested in his future. He was graduating high school as a confident, capable young man whose potential had been unlocked through support I'd provided while hiding in the shadows. As I signed the authorization for Columbia University's tuition payment, using my real name instead of the foundation's administrative identity, I knew I was ending a decade of carefully maintained anonymity. The paper trail would lead directly back to me, exposing the truth about both my success and my secret intervention in David's life. Michael would learn that his prediction about my failure had been spectacularly wrong, that the sister he'd humiliated was the anonymous benefactor who'd been holding his family together. But more importantly, David would learn that family love sometimes works in ways that pride and prejudice make invisible. The empire I'd built from the ashes of Michael's cruelty was about to be revealed, and with it, a different understanding of what success actually means when it's grounded in love rather than superiority. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in May 2021, just as I was reviewing quarterly reports that showed my companies had achieved their highest revenue figures in 5 years. Columbia University's Director of Financial Aid was calling to confirm receipt of the tuition payment for David Davidson, and his tone suggested this wasn't a routine administrative call. Ms. Davidson, I wanted to personally thank you for the extraordinary generosity of your scholarship program, Director Williams said. David's full undergraduate funding represents one of the most comprehensive individual scholarships we've administered. The Hope Springs Foundation's support will transform his educational experience. I felt my stomach clench as I realized the call was being made to my personal number rather than the foundation's administrative line. Somehow the payment authorization had connected my identity directly to David's funding, rather than routing through the anonymous foundation structure I'd carefully constructed. I'm calling because we received some additional paperwork from your bank that includes your personal signature, rather than the foundation's standard authorization, Director Williams continued. I wanted to ensure we have the correct contact information for our donor recognition database. The mistake was mine. In my eagerness to secure David's funding before the enrollment deadline, I'd signed the authorization personally, rather than using the Foundation's administrative process. Years of careful anonymity had been destroyed by a moment of carelessness motivated by love for my nephew. Actually, I said carefully, I prefer to maintain privacy about my involvement with the Foundation's scholarship programs. Could you please ensure that David's family receives only the standard notification about his funding source? But it was too late. Director Williams explained that the university had already sent a comprehensive financial aid package to David's family, including documentation that showed the full scope of his scholarship support and the funding source details required for tax reporting purposes. My personal signature on a $250,000 payment was now part of official university records that would be shared with David's family as part of their financial aid communications. The secret I'd maintained for nearly a decade was about to be exposed through bureaucratic thoroughness I hadn't anticipated. I spent the rest of the day in my home office, staring at reports I couldn't focus on, while calculating how long it would take for the truth to reach Michael. David would receive his financial aid documentation within a week, and even if he didn't immediately recognize my name, Michael certainly would when he reviewed the scholarship details. The waiting was excruciating. I found myself checking my phone constantly, expecting angry calls from Michael, or confused questions from Lisa about why I'd been secretly funding David's care. But days passed without any family contact, and I began to hope that maybe the documentation had been overlooked or misunderstood. On Friday evening, my phone rang with Michael's number displayed on the screen. I stared at it for several rings, knowing that answering would begin a conversation that would change our family dynamics forever. When I finally picked up, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Anna, it's Michael. I need to ask you about something, and I'm hoping there's been some kind of mistake." I took a deep breath, preparing for confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating for years. "What do you need to ask me about?" "David received his financial aid documentation from Columbia today," Michael said slowly. "There's a full scholarship listed from something called the Hope Springs Foundation, funded by someone named Anna Davidson. I'm assuming this is just a coincidence, that there's another Anna Davidson who happens to run a charitable foundation, because the alternative doesn't make sense." The moment had arrived. After 10 years of secret assistance, elaborate anonymity, and careful distance from family interactions, I was about to reveal that the failure he'd predicted had become the success that had been saving his family. "It's not a coincidence, Michael," I said quietly. "I'm the Anna Davidson who founded the Hope Springs Foundation. I've been funding David's care for the past 5 years, including his college tuition." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's impossible. He paused, clearly struggling with the implications of what I'd just confirmed. "You don't have that kind of money. The scholarship is for over $200,000. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," I replied, feeling oddly calm now that the truth was finally emerging. "I've been more successful than you realize, and I've been using that success to help David because he's my nephew, and he deserved support that you couldn't afford to provide." Michael's breathing was audible through the phone as he processed information that contradicted everything he believed about my capabilities and circumstances. The sister he'd dismissed as a failure had been anonymously funding his son's transformation, while he remained completely unaware of her success. "How long?" he asked finally. "How long has the foundation been helping David?" "Since his diagnosis," I said. "I've been covering therapy costs, educational programs, medical expenses, and now his college education. Everything the foundation has provided for David came from me." The admission hung between us like smoke from a bridge burning, ending years of carefully maintained separation, while exposing the extent of my secret intervention in his family's crisis. Michael was learning that his salvation had been coming from the person he'd most thoroughly dismissed, and that revelation was clearly shattering his understanding of both my character and his own circumstances. "I need to see you," he said finally. "We need to talk about this in person. This changes everything." Michael arrived at my house 3 days later, driving slowly up the winding road, as if he couldn't quite believe the address I'd given him was correct. Through my office window, I watched him sit in his car for several minutes, staring at the contemporary hillside home that contradicted everything he thought he knew about my circumstances. The house wasn't ostentatious, but it was substantial. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, professionally landscaped grounds, and the kind of architectural details that suggested success rather than struggle. When Michael finally approached the front door, his expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been shame. "This is your house?" he asked when I opened the door, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose entire worldview had been challenged by evidence he couldn't deny. "I bought it 2 years ago," I said, leading him into the living room where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the valley below. "Please, sit down. Would you like coffee?" Michael remained standing, moving through my space like a detective gathering evidence from a crime scene. He examined the built-in bookshelves filled with business texts and technical manuals, the award plaques on the wall recognizing my company's achievements, the family photos that included pictures of David I'd somehow obtained without his parents' knowledge. "I don't understand," he said finally, settling into a chair that faced the windows rather than me. "The last time we talked, you were working in a coffee shop and living in some terrible apartment. How did you afford all this?" I sat across from him, noting how exhausted he looked despite his expensive suit and careful grooming. 5 years of financial stress and David's intensive care needs had aged him in ways his privileged life had never prepared him for. "I built several successful technology companies," I said simply. "Apps and software platforms that serve markets most entrepreneurs ignore. The businesses generate enough revenue to support both my personal needs and the foundation's charitable work." Michael's laugh was bitter. "Technology companies, of course. And I suppose you're some kind of millionaire now, playing fairy godmother to your unfortunate relatives." The sarcasm was his defense against information he couldn't comfortably process, but I heard the uncertainty beneath his attempted dismissal. Michael was struggling to reconcile the successful entrepreneur sitting across from him with the failure he'd publicly humiliated 10 years earlier. "I'm worth about $12 million, I said quietly, watching his face go pale as the number registered. "My companies employ 47 people and serve over 3 million users worldwide. The foundation has helped more than 200 families, but David was always my primary focus." Michael was silent for a long moment, processing financial figures that exceeded his own professional income, despite his prestigious law practice and advanced degrees. The sister he'd dismissed as worthless had accumulated wealth that made his comfortable lifestyle seem modest by comparison. "Why?" he asked finally. "After everything I said to you, after the way I treated you, why would you help my family? Why would you spend your money on David's care without telling us?" The question struck at the heart of motivations I'd been examining for years. Why had I chosen to help someone who'd been cruel to me? Why had I funded his son's development while accepting no credit or recognition for my intervention? "Because David didn't deserve to suffer for your mistakes," I said. "Because he's an innocent child who needed support that you couldn't provide. And because family love doesn't depend on whether people deserve it." Michael flinched at the word mistakes, clearly uncomfortable with any suggestion that his handling of David's situation had been inadequate, but he also seemed to be struggling with the implications of my explanation, that I'd been motivated by love rather than any desire for recognition or leverage. "You could have told me," he said. "You could have offered to help directly, instead of creating this elaborate charade with the foundation. Would you have accepted help from me?" I asked. "From the family failure you publicly humiliated? Would your pride have allowed you to take money from someone you'd dismissed as worthless?" The question hung in the air as Michael confronted the truth about his own character and the barriers his cruelty had created between us. He'd made it impossible for me to help openly by establishing our relationship as one where he was superior and I was inadequate. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Everything I said about you was wrong. You're not a failure. You're more successful than I've ever been. And you used that success to help my family when I couldn't help them myself." The admission seemed to cost him significant effort, challenging a lifetime of assumptions about his own superiority and my obvious limitations, but it also opened space for a conversation about the family dynamics that had shaped both our lives. "Michael, success isn't about who accumulates the most money or achieves the most recognition," I said. "It's about what you do with whatever resources you have. I was successful because I learned from failure, rather than being destroyed by it." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, finally having the honest conversation about our childhood, our relationship, and our different paths through life that we'd never been able to have before. Michael began to understand how his casual cruelty had motivated my determination, while I began to see how the pressure of being the golden child had created its own forms of limitation and anxiety. "I need to tell David the truth," Michael said, as our conversation concluded. "He deserves to know who's been supporting his education and why, and I need to find a way to repay you for everything you've done." "The money isn't a loan," I said firmly. "It's a gift from his aunt who loves him. But I would like to actually know my nephew instead of just reading about his progress in foundation reports." Michael's smile was tentative but genuine. "I think David would like that too. He's always wondered about the mysterious family member who never comes to gatherings. Maybe it's time for that to change." As he prepared to leave, Michael paused at the door with an expression of profound gratitude, mixed with lingering bewilderment about the transformation our relationship had undergone. "Anna, I'm sorry," he said, "for everything I said, everything I believed about you, and all the years we lost because of my arrogance. You've been more family to David than I knew how to be. The apology began healing wounds that had defined our relationship for decades, but it also marked the beginning of a new dynamic based on truth rather than assumption, respect rather than dismissal, and love that had proven stronger than pride. 6 months after Michael's discovery, I stood in Columbia University's graduation ceremony audience, watching David accept his dean's list recognition as a freshman studying computer science. The young man on stage bore little resemblance to the struggling 7-year-old who'd been diagnosed with neurological challenges 8 years earlier. He was confident, articulate, and clearly thriving in an academic environment that challenged his capabilities. Michael and Sarah sat beside me, their pride evident as they photographed every moment of their son's achievement. But this celebration felt different from previous family gatherings because my presence was finally authentic, rather than obligatory, based on genuine relationships, rather than social expectation. David wants to major in assistive technology, Sarah told me as we walked across campus after the ceremony. He's passionate about developing software that helps people with disabilities access educational and professional opportunities. I think your influence might have something to do with that career choice. I'd been spending time with David throughout his freshman year, sharing meals, discussing his coursework, and gradually building the aunt-nephew relationship that had been impossible when family dynamics required my invisibility. Learning about my companies had inspired his interest in technology entrepreneurship, but learning about the foundation had shaped his understanding of how success could serve social purposes. Aunt Anna, I've been thinking about your business model, David said as we sat in the campus coffee shop, his enthusiasm bubbling over like the teenager he still was despite his academic maturity. You identified underserved markets that bigger companies ignored, then built scalable solutions for people who really needed them. That's exactly what I want to do with assistive technology. Watching my nephew discover his passion for solving problems through innovation filled me with pride that was different from any business achievement I'd experienced. This was family legacy in its purest form, not inherited wealth or accumulated status, but shared values and continuing commitment to using privilege responsibly. My relationship with Michael had evolved into something neither of us had expected. The confrontation that began with his discovery of my success had transformed into regular conversations about business, family, and the different paths we'd taken through life. His respect for my achievements was genuine, but more importantly, he was learning to see me as a person, rather than a disappointment. I've been thinking about what you said about learning from failure, he told me during one of our monthly dinners. I realize I've never really failed at anything important, and that's actually been a limitation. I learned to succeed within existing systems, but never developed the creativity that comes from having to build something from nothing. Michael had also taken steps to address his own character flaws, acknowledging that his dismissal of me had been motivated partly by fear that my struggles reflected poorly on the family's status. He'd been so invested in maintaining appearances that he'd lost sight of what actually mattered, supporting each other through difficulties rather than pretending difficulties didn't exist. Lisa, our sister, had become the bridge between my new visibility and our parents' confusion about the family dynamics they'd missed while my success was developing in secret. Mom and Dad were struggling to understand how they'd failed to recognize my achievements, while simultaneously trying to claim credit for raising such a successful daughter. I always knew Anna was special, Mom told friends at a faculty dinner, conveniently forgetting years of worried conversations about my apparent inability to find direction in life. She just needed time to find her niche. The revisionist history was annoying, but understandable. Parents who'd spent decades explaining my failures to colleagues were now trying to explain their failure to recognize my potential. I chose to accept their belated pride, rather than correcting their selective memory about my early struggles. The Hope Springs Foundation had expanded far beyond David's individual case to become a nationally recognized organization, serving hundreds of families dealing with pediatric challenges. Maria Santos continued as executive director, but I'd begun taking a more public role in the foundation's leadership as the demands of maintaining anonymity became unnecessary. Anna's story demonstrates that the most effective philanthropists often come from communities that understand the problems they're trying to solve, Maria explained during a conference on family-centered charitable giving. Her personal experience with struggle gave her insights into user needs that traditionally educated nonprofit leaders often miss. My business empire continued growing, but I'd begun structuring my companies to prioritize social impact alongside financial returns. Employees received equity stakes that would make them wealthy if our enterprises succeeded, and we'd established profit-sharing programs that distributed success among the people who created it. You're building the kind of companies that I wish I'd worked for when I was younger, explained Jennifer Kim, the venture capital partner who'd supported my early growth. Organizations that generate sustainable value while treating employees as partners rather than resources to be exploited. The wealth I'd accumulated felt meaningful because it was being used to create opportunities for other people, rather than simply accumulating for its own sake. Money became a tool for transformation rather than a measure of personal worth, and that perspective made success feel sustainable rather than hollow. But the most important transformation was personal rather than professional. The failure Michael had predicted in 2011 had taught me lessons about resilience, creativity, and the motivation that comes from having nothing left to lose. Those lessons had built not just financial success, but character that could withstand both failure and achievement without losing sight of what actually mattered. Standing in that university graduation ceremony, surrounded by family members who finally saw me clearly, I understood that the greatest success wasn't proving Michael wrong about my potential. It was proving that love could be stronger than the wounds pride inflicts, and that family relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than assumption. David's achievements were his own, earned through determination, and supported by resources I'd been privileged to provide. But they also represented something larger, the possibility that each generation could learn from the previous generation's mistakes while building on their successes. The young man accepting academic honors on that Columbia stage was my nephew, but he was also my legacy, proof that success shared becomes more meaningful than success hoarded, and that the best revenge against those who dismiss us is becoming someone whose love transforms their understanding of what's possible. The failure Michael had predicted had become the foundation for success he couldn't have imagined, but more importantly, it had become the bridge back to family relationships based on respect rather than superiority, understanding rather than judgment, and love that proved stronger than the cruelest words ever spoken at a family dinner table.